Their name for her was Grease Girl, the son of the wealthy. Marcus Wellington chuckled when Abigail Harper entered the hangar sporting oil-stained coveralls. He had no idea that this basic mechanism was going to seize control of his Black Hawk aircraft and cause him to plead for life-saving aid in a lethal snowfall. Marcus had bought his officer position with money from his father, convinced he could ignore her advice. Only Abigail's hands will save them, though, when the engine dies at 8,000 feet in Storm Helena. Marcus begs for aid. Will she save him or let karma take over? What is your opinion? Should Abigail let him suffer or show him pity? Comment underline below. As Abigail Harper scrubbed grease from her hands with an old rag, the morning sun created long shadows across Fort Blackstone, though few others stopped to note it. At 27, she had already developed a reputation as the greatest helicopter technician on the base. Abigail was little in height, but her emerald eyes blazed with will. Her rough hands may find engine problems stumping veterans. Still, few people appreciated her abilities. The only remaining relic from her grandfather, who had passed while serving his nation in the heavens above Korea, was a strand of brown hair tucked behind her ear and a modification of the old pilot badge attached to her boiler suit. Harper. The voice sounded across the hangar like a whip crack. Marcus Wellington walked through the large doors, his freshly ironed uniform shining somewhat too brilliantly in the fluorescent illumination. Behind him trailed a small entourage of fellow officers, all sons of wealthy families, who had found their way into military service through connections rather than conviction. At 28, he possessed a kind of genetic lottery that money could enhance. 6 feet 1 inch of blonde perfection, with a jawline fit for magazine covers and an ego full before he entered them. Marcus said, not looking at Abigail, "I need you to sign off on the Black Hawk maintenance report." Abigail straightened up from the helicopter she had been inspecting, her expression carefully neutral. She had spent the past hour documenting a worrying vibration in the main rotor assembly, the kind of problem that could turn deadly at altitude. "Sir, I need to discuss some concerns about the engine system before I can approve." Her words were cut short as Marcus grabbed the clipboard from her hands, barely glancing at her detailed notes. The charts and diagrams she had carefully produced clearly showed clear evidence of bearing where that needed immediate attention, but Marcus's attention was already elsewhere, focused on the camera crew that had just entered the hangar. "Listen, wrench monkey," Marcus sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Your job is fixing things, not questioning officers." Without ceremony, he tore her report in half, then quarters, letting the pieces flutter to the concrete floor like confetti. The sound of ripping paper seemed to echo in the sudden silence that filled the hangar. Several mechanics stopped their work to watch, their expressions ranging from shock to carefully hidden sympathy. Marcus grabbed a container of engine oil from a nearby workstation and purposefully tipped it over, letting the black liquid splash across Abigail's boiler suit and pool at her feet. The laughter that burst from his followers was sharp and ugly, filling the cavernous space with the sound of pack animals sensing weakness. "This is where you belong, Grease Girl," Marcus said with theatrical flair, gesturing at the spreading puddle of oil. "On your knees cleaning messes." He turned to address the gathering crowd, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to be the center of attention. "This is the difference between natural leaders and people who just fix things." Abigail knelt slowly, deliberately, her movements precise and controlled despite the rage building in her chest like steam in a boiler. She picked up each torn piece of her report one by one, her fingers steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The oil soaked through the knees of her boiler suit, but she didn't rush, didn't show the humiliation that burned in her throat like acid. Around her, the hangar had gone quiet again, the weight of collective shame pressing down on everyone who W. Marcus was already moving on, basking in the attention of the CNN News crew that had arrived to document his upcoming heroic mission. He straightened his uniform and adjusted the medals on his chest, decorations that Abigail had noticed bore serial numbers that didn't exist in any military database. She had photographed them weeks earlier, driven by a curiosity that had served her well in her mechanical work. As Marcus began his practice speech about duty and service, Abigail quietly slipped to SM, But as she watched Marcus bask in the attention of reporters and fellow officers, Abigail knew he would never listen. Men like Marcus Wellington didn't listen to women like her. Not until it was too late. She touched her grandfather's pilot badge and whispered a quiet promise. "I'll prove the Harper name means something." But Abigail didn't know that tomorrow she would take control of Marcus' destiny in ways she never could have imagined. In the warm safety of the meteorology office, forecasters traced the storm's path with increasing concern, knowing that this was the kind of weather system that earned its own chapter in textbooks about natural disasters. But in the executive briefing room, where leather chairs surrounded a polished mahogany table, the storm represented something entirely different to Marcus Wellington. Storm Helena was descending on the Pacific Northwest, with winds over 150 miles per hour and temperatures falling to minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Marcus said, "Gentlemen, this is exactly the kind of situation that separates true leaders from ordinary people. Your perfectly groomed appearance contrasts sharply with the tired faces of the duty officers who have been monitoring the crisis through the night." Marcus said, standing before a wall-mounted display showing the projected path of the storm. Marcus saw only opportunity. A children's hospital in Seattle was cut off by the storm, their vital supply running low. The only way to provide relief was by helicopter. Military helicopters represented the only viable option for delivering the life-saving supplies. Behind him, the storm radar showed a whirl of destruction that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. It was exactly the kind of mission that Marcus had been waiting for. High stakes, media attention, and the chance to position himself as a hero in front of the cameras. Jake Morrison, a 45-year-old pilot whose weathered face told the story of 2 decades in military aviation, shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Marcus outlined his plan. Jake had flown through hurricanes, desert sandstorms, and mountain turbulence that would terrify commercial pilots. But something about Marcus' enthusiasm made his stomach clench with unease. "Sir," Jake interjected carefully, "the meteorology team is recommending we wait for a break in the storm system. The winds at altitude are going to be—" His words died as Marcus fixed him with the kind of stare that wealthy men use to silence inconvenient truths. "Are you questioning my judgment, Morrison?" Marcus' voice carried the subtle thread of someone accustomed to destroying careers with a phone call. "Because I seem to remember that my family's $50 million contribution to this base came with certain expectations about the quality of personnel we maintain here." Except for the howl of electronics and the distant sound of wind starting to howl around the building's corner, the room was silent. Jake suppressed his protests, knowing that his wife and children's future rested on his conformity with Marcus' idea of heroism. "Mr. Wellington, perhaps we could discuss backup safety protocols, given the severity of the weather conditions." But Marcus was already turning away, his attention captured by the CNN News crew that had just been escorted into the briefing room by base security. Dr. Jennifer Hayes, the 35-year-old emergency physician accompanying the mission, tried a different approach. Her years in trauma medicine had taught her to read the signs of impending disaster, and everything about this mission screamed danger. "Ladies and gentlemen of the media, you're about to witness something special. The Wellington family doesn't not just write checks. We put our lives on the line for our fellow Americans." Marcus's attitude changed immediately and theatrically. His posture straightened. His voice took on the resonant quality of a practiced public speaker. His smile became the kind of brilliant display that photographers love to capture. The cameras rolled as Marcus launched into a speech about duty, courage, and the sacred trust between military and civilians. His words carefully chosen to create the kind of sound bites that would dominate news cycles. What the cameras didn't capture was the quiet conversation Marcus had with his personal aide in the corner of the room, where he outlined his plan to modify the flight path to take them directly through the storm's most photogenic sections. Marcus had already guaranteed that the backup safety systems would be turned off, not because they were unnecessary, but rather because their warnings would create negative optics for the cameras. The original mission path had been designed for safety, skirting the worst of the weather while still accomplishing the objective. Marcus would take them through mountain passes, where the wind and snow would create the kind of dramatic footage that launched political careers. Marcus had not only ignored her warnings about the engine problems, but he had actively overridden safety procedures that should have grounded the aircraft. Her attempts to send warning emails to the base command structure met with systematic blocking, the digital equivalent of having doors slammed in her face. Abigail Harper worked feverishly at her old laptop, her fingers flying across keys worn smooth by years of use. The data she found confirmed her worst fears. Marcus had not only ignored her warnings about the engine problems, but he had actively overridden safety protocols that should have grounded the aircraft. The final insult came when security personnel arrived to escort her from the hangar, acting on orders that came directly from Marcus' office. As they led her away, she could hear the CNN reporter interviewing Marcus about his heroic decision to risk everything for the children of Seattle. The irony was bitter as battery acid. The man who had called her just a mechanic was about to put lives at risk while ignoring the mechanical expertise that could save them. But hidden in the Blackhawk's cock 15 minutes after takeoff, Marcus would find that note just as the helicopter engine began making the exact sound she had warned about. The Blackhawk took off from Fort Blackstone, the storm's chill already gripping the air. Jake Morrison's steady hands gripped the controls as they ascended into the chaos. But as they climbed toward their cruising altitude of 8,500 feet, the first wisps of cloud began to wrap around the aircraft like ghostly fingers, and Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with flying into the unknown. Marcus Wellington occupied the co-pilot's seat with the casual confidence of someone who had purchased his position rather than earned it through years of training and experience. His uniform remained crisp and perfectly pressed, despite the increasing turbulence, and he seemed more interested in adjusting his appearance for the small camera mounted in the cockpit than in monitoring the flight instruments. Behind them, Dr. Jennifer Hayes checked and rechecked her medical supplies, her movements efficient despite the growing anxiety that knotted her stomach. The precious cargo of medicine secured in the rear compartment represented hope for dozens of children, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were flying into a trap that nature herself had set. The storm's outer bands hit them like a physical blow at 7,000 feet, sending the helicopter lurching through the air as if an invisible giant had seized it and begun shaking it like a toy. Jake's knuckles went white on the controls as he fought to maintain level flight, his years of experience automatically compensating for the violent air currents that tried to tear the aircraft apart. So he called over the increasing noise of wind and struggling engines. "I'm reading some unusual vibrations in the main rotor assembly. We should consider returning to base." But Marcus was busy adjusting his position for the camera, apparently oblivious to the warning signs that were making Jake's blood run cold. Marcus unfolded the little piece of paper that had somehow found its way into his seat cushion, a folded note that must have been placed there before takeoff, with idle curiosity, expecting perhaps a good luck message from one of his admirers. Instead, he found himself staring at 7 words written in exact feminine handwriting. "Check the engine, you fool." The color drained from his face as he recognized Abigail Harper's writing. The same careful script that had filled the maintenance reports, the engine temperature readings were rising steadily into the red zone, and the vibration that Jake had mentioned was clearly visible in the way the instruments shook in their housings. Marcus actually looked at the instrument panel for the first time since takeoff, and what he saw made his mouth go dry with terror. The sound that filled the cockpit was wrong. Instead of the steady, forceful beat of a healthy helicopter, the main rotor bearing, weakened by months of inadequate maintenance and pushed beyond its limits by the storm's strong air currents, chose that moment to catastrophically fail. The helicopter lurched sickeningly to one side as the rotor assembly began to tear itself apart, filling the cockpit with the sound of grinding metal and the acrid smell of burning oil. Marcus's hands shook as he grabbed the radio. Her voice trembled, barely more than a whisper. Jake Morrison, veteran of 100 dangerous flights, fought the controls with every ounce of skill he possessed. But the laws of physics had taken command of the aircraft. "Mayday, mayday," he shouted into his headset. "Rescue 1 is going down. Repeat, we are going down." Dr. Hayes was thrown against the cabin wall as the helicopter entered an uncontrolled spin, her medical supplies scattering across the floor in a cascade of broken glass and spilled medicine. She could see Jake, slumped over T. Marcus, was screaming into the radio with the hysteria of someone who had never faced actual danger. "This is Richard Wellington's son. I need help now. Do you understand who I am?" But the storm had already claimed their radio communications, so reducing his desperate cries to static that no one would ever hear. The ground rushed up to meet them through the swirling snow, and Jake summoned his last reserves of consciousness to pull the helicopter out of its death spiral. His final act as a pilot was to aim for a narrow ledge of rock that jutted from the mountainside, a landing spot that would kill them all if he missed by even a few feet, but their only chance of survival if his aim was true. The Black Hawk struck the ledge with the sound of tearing metal and shattering glass, bouncing once before settling into a precarious position that left half the aircraft hanging over a 1,000-foot drop into the valley below. Marcus Wellington felt his first true humility in the sudden silence that followed the crash, broken only by the whisper of settling snow and the tick of cooling metal. The man who had bought his officer's rank with Daddy's money now sat in the wreckage of his arrogance, understanding for the first time in his privileged life that money could not buy him out of every situation. Abigail Harper heard the faint distress signal that passed the base's communication system 300 meters away, in a military jail cell at Fort Blackstone. She knew coldly, with great clarity, that she was about to take control of Marcus's fate in ways he never could have imagined. Dr. Hayes worked feverishly to stabilize Jake's injuries, while Marcus fumbled with the emergency radio, his hand shaking so badly she could barely operate the simple controls. Fort Blackstone's security cell was intended to house troops who had committed minor infractions, drinking too much on liberty, fighting in the enlisted club, or showing up late for duty one too many times. Not someone with Abigail Harper's unique mix of mechanical brilliance and desperate determination. She had heard that particular mix of urgent tones only twice in her career, both times when helicopters had gone down in conditions that left little hope for survival. Abigail quickly assessed the cell, her mind already planning her escape. The lock mechanism was standard military issue, robust but not sophisticated, and the hair clip she had managed to conceal during her arrest would serve her purposes perfectly. The sound of the emergency alert klaxons echoing through the base corridor told her everything she needed to know about the fate of Marcus Wellington's heroic mission. Storm Helena contact lost. Search and rescue. Her fingers worked steadily at the lock mechanism while her mind processed the fragments of radio chatter that penetrated the thick walls of her cell. The pieces fell into place like components in an engine rebuild, creating a picture that filled her with equal parts vindication and fear. At 52, Captain Rodriguez had seen enough military tragedies to identify the indicators of a mission gone catastrophically wrong, and the weight of command seemed to press down on his shoulders like a physical burden. He stood in the base command center staring at the bank of screens showing nothing but motionlessness where Rescue 1's signal should have been. "We lost all contact approximately 15 minutes ago. Last known position was grid reference 77L, bearing 270 degrees." Rodriguez studied the weather radar display, watching the massive spiral of Storm Helena as it hammered the mountains where his people had vanished. The storm made search and rescue impossible. No aircraft could survive. Ground teams wouldn't reach the crash for hours. The communications specialist said Marcus Wellington's family name carried enough political weight to guarantee that someone would finally start a rescue effort, but finally might be too late for the injured survivors clinging to life on some isolated mountain top. "Sir, we have an unauthorized aircraft departure from Hangar 7. It was during this heated debate that a radar operator noticed an anomaly on his screen. A single aircraft signature moving against the storm with purpose and accuracy that seemed almost supernatural." His voice cut across the argument like a blade. Captain Rodriguez rushed to the radar console, his eyes widening as he tracked the solitary blip moving steadily into the heart of Storm Helena. "Who the hell authorized a flight in these conditions?" he demanded, already knowing that no one had been foolish enough to give such an order. The answer came from the hangar security team, the report crackling with static and disbelief. "Sir, Mechanic Harper is gone. Her cell door was open, and someone took the backup Black Hawk without authorization." Rodriguez said, "She's either completely insane, or she's the only person on this base who actually knows what she's doing. His stomach dropped as he realized what was happening. The woman they had locked down for interfering with Marcus Wellington's mission was now flying solo into the same storm that had just claimed Rescue One. High above the mountains, Abigail Harper fought the most difficult flight of her life, through conditions that would have challenged pilots with decades more experience. The backup Black Hawk bucked and pitched in the savage winds like a small boat in a hurricane, but her hands remained steady on the controls as she navigated by instruments and instinct. She had learned to fly by pestering the base pilots during her off-duty hours, trading mechanical work for flight lessons in a dozen different aircraft types. Now, that unconventional education was the only thing standing between Marcus Wellington and a frozen grave on some unnamed peak. The crash site appeared through the swirling snow like a vision from a nightmare. Abigail could see movement in the cockpit, which meant at least some of the crew had survived the initial impact. But the precarious position of the wreck told her that any rescue attempt would have to be executed with surgical accuracy. A single mistake would send the damaged aircraft tumbling into the abyss, taking any survivors with it. The twisted wreckage of Rescue One perched impossibly on a ledge of rock that seemed too narrow to support a bicycle, much less a 12,000-pound helicopter. She brought the backup helicopter into a hover just feet from the wreckage, her rotors whirling the snow into a blinding vortex that limited vision to mere inches. Through the chaos, she could see Marcus Wellington's face pressed against the cracked cockpit window, the same face that had mocked her just hours earlier, now transformed by terror and desperation into almost unrecognizable form. Their eyes met, and in that moment the balance of power between them shifted as fundamentally as tectonic plates realigning beneath the earth. When Marcus stumbled from the wreckage into her helicopter, his perfect uniform torn and stained with blood and hydraulic fluid, he was no longer the confident young officer who had humiliated her in front of the entire base. "Abigail," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "I was wrong. I was so terribly wrong." But she cut him off with a look that could have frozen the storm itself. "Save your breath," she said, her voice carrying the cold precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "I'm not rescuing you because you deserve it. I'm doing it because I'm not like you." The backup Black Hawk shuddered and groaned as systems started failing one by one. The victim of Marcus Wellington's past attempt to improve the helicopter's performance through modifications that his limited knowledge had turned into sabotage. Hydraulic fluid leaked from severed lines where he had tried to install aftermarket components, and the flight controls responded sluggishly to Abigail's increasingly desperate inputs. Jake Morrison lay unconscious in the passenger cabin. His breathing was shallow and erratic as Dr. Hayes used supplies taken from the medical kit to stabilize his head damage. The mathematics of their circumstances were quite straightforward. They had maybe 20 minutes of flying time left before the damaged helicopter would be unable to maintain altitude. Marcus cowered in the corner of the cabin, his face pale with the recognition that his earlier tampering had turned their rescue helicopter into another death trap. "I was trying to help," he stammered, his voice breaking like a child's. "I thought if I upgraded some of the components, made them more efficient," but Abigail silenced him with a gesture, her attention focused entirely on the twisted wreckage of the original Black Hawk that lay scattered across the narrow ledge. Her engineer's mind was already working through possibilities that would have seemed impossible to anyone without her unique combination of desperate creativity and mechanical genius. "Help me move Jake to the emergency shelter," she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that Marcus found himself obeying without question. Together, they established a makeshift medical station in the lee of a large boulder where Dr. Hayes could continue her work while protected from the worst of a storm. The children's medicine was transferred to the same location, precious vials that represented hope for dozens of young patients who were depending on them to complete their mission. The main rotor assembly was destroyed beyond repair, but the tail rotor remained intact and several vital engine components could be adapted to serve new uses. Abigail turned her attention to the apparently impossible task that would decide whether they lived or died on this frozen mountainside. She approached the wreckage of the original helicopter with the same methodical precision she brought to any mechanical problem, her trained eyes cataloging damage and assessing salvageable components. "What are you doing?" Marcus asked, watching in amazement as Abigail started demolishing both helicopters with tools improvised from the survival kit and debris from the crash. Her movements were fast and sure, despite the numbing cold that turned her breath to clouds of vapor and made her fingers clumsy inside her work gloves. Marcus said, most importantly, the cheap, inferior parts he had bought to replace military-grade components could actually work to her advantage. "There are lower tolerances. I'm going to build us a way home," she replied without looking up from her work. "I'm going to take the best parts from both helicopters and create something that can fly us out of here." The task she had set herself was theoretically impossible, combining components from two different aircraft, using improvised tools in sub-zero temperatures, while working against a deadline measured in the gradual weakening of Jake's vital signs. But Abigail Harper had spent her entire life proving that impossible was just another word for challenging, and she attacked the problem with the focused intensity of someone who had nothing left to lose. She cannibalized the backup helicopter's engine to replace the damaged components in the original aircraft, using Marcus' inferior parts as adapters and interfaces that military regulations would never have allowed. Marcus watched in growing amazement as the woman he had dismissed as just a mechanic performed feats of engineering that bordered on miraculous. She welded critical joints using a cutting torch improvised from the helicopter's emergency oxygen system, and she fabricated replacement parts from pieces of the aircraft's own structure. Her grandfather's pilot badge caught the light as she worked, a constant reminder of the legacy she carried and the standards she was determined to uphold. "You're actually doing it," Marcus whispered, his voice filled with an awe that he had never felt for any of the material possessions his family's wealth had provided. But Abigail was saving the most dramatic moment for last. As the hybrid helicopter began to take shape around them, she deliberately allowed Marcus to believe that her efforts were failing. She cursed convincingly as she struggled with the particularly stubborn component, and she allowed frustration to show in her voice as she announced that the engine wouldn't start. Marcus, true to his nature, could not resist the chance to show his superiority. "See," he said with returning confidence, "women just cry when it gets hard. This is exactly why it's not working." Marcus said, slumped against the aircraft with apparent defeat, "I can't get the power systems to integrate properly." As Abigail set the ignition sequence, his words died in his throat, and the hybrid helicopter surged to life with a sound like controlled thunder, from the jury-rigged flight controls responding to her touch like extensions of her own will to the makeshift engine management computer. Every system she had developed operated flawlessly. "Surprise, you fool," she responded, smiling with almost no warmth at all. The helicopter stayed steady against the mountain edge, its rotors throbbing with the rhythm of controlled force, while the storm winds whirled snow about them in a whirlwind of white wrath. Marcus Wellington had a flash of insight as they placed Jake into the passenger cabin and ready for the most perilous departure of their life. The lady he had embarrassed and rejected had just completed something that, with limitless resources, qualified engineers would have thought impossible. She had seized control not only of the circumstances, but of the basic principles of physics and probability guiding their survival. Marcus also understood he had lost more than his arrogance in the mountains of Storm Helena, as the hybrid Blackhawk soared down the mountain edge with the elegance of a bird taking flight. He had lost any delusion that his wealth and contacts made him better than the folks who actually worked the earth. Through the heart of Storm Helena, the flight back to Fort Blackstone taxed every ability Abigail Harper had developed over years of unofficial flight training and mechanical invention. Though the storm looked determined to claim them as its last victims, the hybrid aircraft responded to her orders with the accuracy of a fine instrument. While ice developed on the rotor blades with terrifying speed, threatening to break the delicate balance, keeping the aircraft afloat, winds blowing to nearly 170 miles per hour tried to rip the aircraft apart. With hands steady on the controls as she negotiated conditions that would have challenged pilots with 10 times her experience, Abigail flew with the confidence of someone who had already achieved the impossible. Using tools and approaches outside of emergency medicine, Dr. Hayes kept Jake Morrison alive in the passenger compartment, working desperately. As the chopper bucked and pitched through the storm, his vital signs swung wildly. Nevertheless, the doctor's deft hands never wavered from their work. The priceless load of children's medication stayed safe in its especially made containers. Each vial stood for hope for young patients whose life hung in jeopardy. Marcus Wellington sat in shocked quiet, his former haughtiness replaced with a rising awareness of just how totally he had misunderstood the woman currently saving all their lives. As they neared the base, the radio buzzed to life. Captain Rodriguez's voice sliced through the silence with a mixture of relief and incredulity. "Blackhawk 27, says Fort Blackstone Tower. Verify your identify and status, please." With one hand keying the microphone and keeping control of the airplane with the other, Abigail's voice was cool and professional in the middle of turmoil all around. "Tower, Harper in the backup aircraft is mechanical. Among the Rescue 1 survivors I have on board is one serious casualty needing rapid medical treatment. Ask for medical teams standing by and top landing clearance." The quiet that followed her communication said volumes about the shock coursed through the base command hierarchy. Having completed what trained search and rescue teams could not even try, the lady they had detained for meddling with Marcus Wellington was now returning as the hero of her own rescue operation. Rodriguez said, "Mechanic Harper," his voice under control, "you are cleared for immediate landing on Pad 7. Standing by is the medical crew." But the captain was already computing the political earthquake that would follow Abigail's improbable victory soon as he pronounced those words. The landing was flawless, a textbook technique that positioned the hybrid helicopter precisely where the medical crew could offer Jake Morrison instantaneous help. Abigail Harper emerged from the aircraft she had literally constructed from the debris of calamity as the rotor spun down and the storm raged above. Her coveralls still bore oil from Marcus's past humiliation, but today those stains felt more like badges of honor than signs of guilt. Many of the same folks who had laughed when Marcus dropped her maintenance report to the ground were among the gathering surrounding the landing pad, but their reactions now reflected a mix of astonishment and guilt that fit the scope of her accomplishment. Marcus Wellington came out of the chopper like a man waking from a dream, his pristine outfit now ripped and stained with the knowledge of survival. Faced with the gathering of fellow officers and enlisted troops who had seen his humiliation and Abigail's success, the false decorations on his chest felt to weigh him down. He knew what it was to be very little in the company of actual excellence for the first time in his pampered existence. His hands shaking as he acknowledged the deception he had been living, he reached up and started taking down the bought decorations from his uniform without anyone asking. Marcus said, his voice echoing across the gathering despite the roaring wind, "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to tell you the truth about what happened today." Sensing a narrative even more gripping than the spectacular rescue they had anticipated to cover, the CNN News crew, which had been ready to record his joyful return, quickly changed their cameras. After I disregarded her warnings and placed everyone at danger with my conceit and ineptitude, Abigail Harper rescued our lives today. I am somewhat embarrassed of how I handled her. She is the real hero here. Fort Blackstone had never seen anything like the medal ceremony that followed. With her hands carrying the scars and burns of her mechanical work and her hair still damp with melting snow, Abigail Harper entered the hangar, sporting the same oil-stained boiler suit she had worn during the rescue. There was no more clear contrast than Marcus's costly dress attire, but each person in that hangar knew who merited their attention and affection. The burst of applause was overwhelming when the base commander pinned the Medal of Honor for heroism on her coveralls. Not the polite applauding of military protocol, but the real gratitude of people who acknowledged extraordinary courage and talent. "I don't need titles or special recognition," Abigail responded when presented a field promotion to officer rank. Her voice resonated over the quiet hangar with the subdued power of someone who has proved herself in the most trying conditions. "I simply need people to know that I am better than anyone on this base in controlling a Black Hawk helicopter." The laughing that followed was sincere and kind, appreciating not only her technical ability, but also her ability to seize control of a circumstance that would have defeated weaker individuals. Marcus Wellington walked up to Abigail with the reluctant steps of someone asking pardon from someone they had profoundly offended as the ceremony came to an end and the audience started to leave. Quietly, he murmured, "I don't expect you to forgive me." His voice almost heard above the still, raging storm outside. "But I want you to know that right now I understand. You saved not only our lives today. You gave me an example of actual leadership." Abigail looked at his face for a minute and saw real regret where formerly arrogance had dwelt. She answered, "The first lesson in real leadership is learning to respect the people who do the work." And Abigail Harper realized she had not only survived a crisis, but also profoundly altered the way her world ran as Storm Helena started to diminish in the early hours of the next morning. 6 months following Storm Helena, Fort Blackstone looked very different from the base, where Abigail Harper had previously knelt to gather RIP maintenance reports as Marcus Wellington laughed with his affluent cronies. Harper Memorial Hangar was the new name for the main hangar. Its shining sign reminds us daily that real bravery originated from ability and bravery rather than riches and connections. 20 young women from around the nation worked with seasoned mechanics and pilots in that hangar, acquiring the skills needed to be the next generation of military aviation experts. From Abigail's personal idea into a model for military education programs all around, the Harper Flight program had drawn national attention and significant financing. Though she insisted on keeping the hands-on style that had always defined her character, Abigail herself had changed personally. She might have entered an administrative office and assigned the technical tasks to subordinates as the director of the program bearing her name. Rather, she spent her mornings instructing engine repair to students ranging in age from 18 to 35, and her afternoons guiding flight training activities that tested both aircraft and pilots to their capacity. Her coveralls still showed her grandfather's pilot badge, but now it was accompanied by the Medal of Honor she wore with subdued dignity instead of excessive exhibition. Through her curriculum, Emily Watson stood in for everything Abigail aimed for. At 19, the rural Alabama young woman had the same mix of innate mechanical skill and resolute spirit that had guided Abigail along her own challenging path. Emily had grown up poor, learning to fix engines out of need rather than choice like her master. She also brought to her studies a level of intensity that amazed even the toughest professors. "Remember," Abigail advised her during a particularly difficult hydraulic systems class, "don't let anyone tell you that you can't take control of your own destiny." Marcus Wellington had the most amazing metamorphosis. His path from privileged enemy to committed student had drawn a lot of attention within the military community. His rich family was surprised by his decision to willingly turn in his bought officer's commission and asked to be assigned as an enlisted mechanic under Abigail's direction, a choice that delighted the base staff, who remembered his past arrogance. He now spent his days studying the basic abilities he had written off as under his control. The calloused hands of someone who really made a living replaced his fancy manicure. "Be careful with that rotor assembly," Emily said, calling out with barely veiled laughter as Marcus battled a particularly tough bearing housing. "You might break the helicopter once more." Though Marcus knew he would most likely never completely avoid the results of his past behavior, the laughing that followed was good-natured rather than merciless. He had found that although buying the look of power was quite easy, obtaining real respect was far more rewarding. He was gradually coming to be the kind of person he had always claimed to be under Abigail's gentle direction. Though he sometimes joked that the event had knocked some sense into his head along with creating the concussion, Jake Morrison had made a total recovery from his injuries. Working closely with Abigail, the new chief pilot for the base developed training courses stressing both technical proficiency and practical problem-solving abilities. Often telling guests visiting the Harper program in action, he said, "She's created something unique here. These young women are not only acquiring helicopter flying techniques, they are developing leadership and engineering-like thinking." The program's success drew interest from military authorities and civilian teachers all around, which resulted in congressional hearings and legislative amendments opening doors for women in once male-dominated military specialties. Invited to speak at military academies and colleges, Abigail shared her tale with audiences motivated by her example of tenacity and success. She always stressed, though, that the true heroes were the teachers who devoted their careers to producing the next generation of military leaders and the students who dared to push themselves. Abigail considered the road that had gotten her to this point on a clear fall morning as she watched a group of Blackhawks piloted solely by Harper Program alumni perform a flawless training session. The terrified, angry young woman who had knelt in oil and humiliation seemed like someone from another lifetime replaced by a strong leader who had learned to focus her suffering into positive transformation. Marcus went gently, his own change clear in the polite manner he waited for permission to talk. He said just, "Thank you for showing me what actual control entails." As Abigail watched her pupils bank their aircraft into the morning sun, their formation neat and professional as they displayed skills that would benefit them all through their military careers, she said, her voice bearing the knowledge of someone who had battled for every success, "You learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes you have to give up control in order to be really in charge." The Harper Program stood for more than just a course of instruction. It was evidence that true power came from pushing people up to reach heights they had never dreamed imaginable rather than from crushing them. Abigail Harper gently promised the future as the helicopters vanished into the distance, their rotor sounds blending into the daily hum of a bustling military installation. Far more than a Blackhawk chopper, the plain lady who had been written off as merely a mechanic had acquired authority. She had seized her own destiny and applied it to transform the planet for everyone who would come after her. And young women who had never thought of military careers were learning they too could learn to fly in hangars and flying schools all around. You had seen it. You observed it. Share it now with someone who enjoys drama far more than you do. That corresponds to the HOA Journal,